The galaxy received a final signal from Earth at a time when no one was truly listening anymore. Space was busy with trade routes, patrol fleets, and quiet wars between distant empires, but this signal cut through all of it. It did not arrive with alarms or flashing warnings. It did not interrupt systems with force. It simply appeared, calm and steady, requesting to be heard. Many communication officers almost ignored it, thinking it was just another weak attempt from a planet that had already lost its place in the stars. Earth had sent messages before. Pleas for peace, offers of cooperation, warnings spoken softly and respectfully. Every time those messages were delayed, filtered, laughed at, or erased. The galaxy had decided long ago that humanity was not important. Humans were seen as divided, emotional, and fragile. A species that talked too much about peace was never taken seriously. Yet this signal felt different, and that difference made some hearts uneasy. In the great halls of the Empire, alien leaders gathered as the transmission began to spread from system to system. These were beings who ruled thousands of worlds, creatures who had never known real defeat. Their skin colors varied, their shapes were strange, but their thinking was the same. Power decided truth. Strength decided worth. To them, Earth was a small blue planet that had survived only because it had not yet been crushed fully. When news arrived that Earth was sending another message, laughter echoed through council chambers. Some mocked the humans openly, saying they were begging again, trying to delay the inevitable. Others joked that perhaps Earth was finally offering surrender, ready to hand over its resources in exchange for survival. The idea that this message could matter was not taken seriously by most of them. But not everyone laughed. In the shadowed corners of command rooms, veteran fleet commanders felt something cold move through their thoughts. These were beings who had seen wars begin and end, who had watched strong civilizations fall apart because they misunderstood one small detail. They noticed the tone of the signal before they heard the words. It was calm in a way that felt unnatural. Desperate species did not sound calm. Dying worlds screamed, threatened, cried, or pleaded. Earth did none of these things. The signal was steady, controlled, and patient, as if it was not asking for permission but offering a final chance. Some commanders asked for deeper scans, trying to read hidden codes or weapon signals inside the transmission, but found nothing unusual. That made it worse. There was no fear in it, no rush, only certainty. Across the galaxy, communication stations replayed the opening seconds again and again. The background noise was low, almost gentle. Then a human voice began to speak. It was not raised. It did not shake. It spoke slowly, clearly, using simple words that even automated translators could easily convert. The voice did not introduce itself with titles or demands. It did not beg the galaxy to stop. It simply stated that this was Earth's final transmission. That one sentence alone caused unease in places that had long forgotten what fear felt like. Final messages were usually sent after defeat, but Earth had not yet fallen completely. Its homeworld still stood. Its fleets, though smaller, still existed. Why call this final now? As the message continued to spread, old records were pulled up by analysts who suddenly felt the need to understand what they might have missed. They reviewed humanity's past attempts at peace. Years ago, Earth had joined the galactic community with hope. Humans shared medical knowledge, offered trade routes, and opened cultural exchanges. They learned alien languages, respected borders, and followed rules that were not written for them. When early attacks came from border raiders and smaller powers, Earth did not respond with war. Instead, they sent diplomats. They asked for talks. They believed understanding could solve anything. This behavior was seen as weakness. In the galaxy, mercy was not admired. It was exploited. Soon after, larger empires began testing Earth's limits. Human colonies on distant moons were attacked. Mining stations went silent. Civilian ships disappeared along trade lanes. Each time, Earth sent reports and requests for investigation. Each time, the Empire delayed action or claimed there was no proof. When Earth finally warned that continued attacks would have consequences, the warning was ignored. The Empire believed humans were bluffing. After all, they always talked about peace. What could they possibly do? Now, as the final signal echoed through space, some of those same officials felt a strange pressure in their chests. They remembered those warnings and realized something uncomfortable. Humans had never promised revenge. They had only promised consequences. The difference mattered more than anyone had thought. In one distant command station near the Empire's outer border, an old alien admiral stood alone, watching the transmission play on a large screen. He had fought humans before in small skirmishes that never made it into official records. He remembered human soldiers clearly. They were not the strongest or the fastest, but they adapted quickly. They learned enemy patterns faster than expected. Most of all, they protected each other in ways that did not make sense to him at the time. They risked their lives for civilians, for wounded allies, even for strangers. At first, he had seen this as foolishness. Now, watching the calm human message, he wondered if that same loyalty had been turned inward, focused entirely on survival. The signal reached neutral worlds next, places that had tried to stay out of conflict. Their leaders watched with concern. They had ignored Earth's suffering, choosing comfort over responsibility. Some now felt guilt, but it came mixed with fear. If Earth was truly finished asking for help, then whatever came next would not be limited by old rules. Neutrality only worked when someone cared enough to respect it. The calm human voice suggested that respect might no longer matter. As minutes passed, reports came in from intelligence divisions across the galaxy. Human military activity had increased quietly over the past years. Shipyards once thought inactive were suddenly full. Energy readings from deep space suggested hidden installations. None of this had triggered alarms before because it had been done slowly, carefully, without drawing attention. Humanity had learned how the galaxy watched for threats and had chosen to grow in places where no one was looking. This realization spread unease like a shadow. If humans had been preparing all this time, then the final message was not a warning of defeat. It was a marker, a line being drawn. Back in the Empire's capital, laughter began to fade. Council members shifted in their seats as advisors whispered updates into their ears. Still, pride held strong. The Empire had crushed stronger enemies than Earth. They controlled fleets that darkened stars and weapons that could burn planets. One calm message did not change that reality. Some leaders argued that allowing the message to finish was already a mistake, that Earth should be silenced immediately to maintain authority. Others suggested letting it play out, confident it would end in another empty plea. The debate itself showed something rare. Uncertainty had entered the room. Meanwhile, on Earth, the situation was very different. Deep beneath the planet's surface, human leaders and commanders watched the same transmission being sent outward. They did not celebrate. They did not cheer. Faces were tired, lined with years of loss. Many had argued against sending this message, fearing it would change nothing. Others believed it was necessary not for the galaxy, but for humanity itself. The message was not meant to convince anyone. It was meant to close a chapter. Whatever happened after, humans would face it knowing they had spoken clearly one last time. The calm tone of the transmission was not accidental. It had been practiced countless times. Psychologists, linguists, and strategists worked together to remove anger, fear, and hate from every word. Not because humans did not feel those things, but because they did not want them to guide what came next. Rage was easy. Control was harder. The voice that spoke carried the weight of billions, but it refused to beg. It refused to threaten. It simply stated facts, as if history itself were speaking. As the message reached the farthest edges of known space, reactions varied. Some younger species felt curiosity, even sympathy. They had not been part of the old decisions that led to Earth's suffering. Others felt annoyance, seeing the transmission as an interruption. But even among those, a question began to form quietly. Why would a planet on the edge of destruction sound so sure of itself? Why would a species known for emotion choose calm now, of all times? The answer did not come immediately, and that delay made the tension worse. Silence followed parts of the transmission, deliberate pauses that forced listeners to wait. In war, silence often meant fear. In this case, it felt like patience. Earth was not rushing. It was allowing the galaxy time to understand what it had already decided. By the time the first part of the message finished playing, something had changed. Not in fleets or borders, but in perception. Earth was no longer just a weak planet asking to be spared. It was an unknown variable, and unknowns were dangerous. Some commanders ordered their fleets to higher alert just in case. Others dismissed the feeling and returned to routine, refusing to show doubt. But even they replayed the message later, alone, listening for something they might have missed. The question echoed everywhere, spoken aloud in some places and only thought in others. Why would a dying planet sound so confident? No one had an answer yet. But deep across the galaxy, in places where power had never been challenged, a quiet understanding began to form. Confidence did not always come from strength alone. Sometimes it came from a decision already made, a path already chosen, one that did not require approval. And that understanding, more than the message itself, planted the first seed of real fear. The memory of how peace was rejected still burned quietly across the galaxy, even if most chose to forget it. Long before the final transmission, Earth had tried again and again to reach out, not as a conqueror but as a neighbor asking to be heard. Humanity did not arrive with war fleets or threats. They arrived with open hands. They shared food technology that could grow crops on dead worlds, medical knowledge that cured diseases other species had accepted as fate, and navigation data that made dangerous routes safer for everyone. Human diplomats spoke carefully, always choosing words that avoided insult, always showing respect to traditions older than their own history. They believed that if different species talked long enough, understanding would come. For a while, it seemed possible. Trade agreements were signed. Cultural exchanges began. Humans welcomed alien visitors to Earth, showing them oceans, cities, and families, hoping that seeing real lives would create empathy. But empathy was not valued in the Empire. It was seen as weakness wearing a friendly face. The first cracks appeared quietly. Human cargo ships were delayed without reason. Trade routes near Earth were suddenly declared unsafe, even when there was no proof. Then came the small attacks. A mining station went silent near the edge of human space. The Empire claimed pirates were responsible. Earth accepted the explanation, even though evidence was thin. When another colony lost power and communication, humans sent investigators instead of soldiers. They still believed mistakes could happen. They still believed peace deserved patience. Each time, the Empire watched closely, learning how far humanity would bend without breaking. To them, this was not diplomacy. It was testing prey. As losses grew, voices on Earth began to change. Families mourned quietly. Names were added to memorial walls that grew longer each year. Still, Earth did not strike back. Human leaders stood before their people and asked for calm, promising that talks were ongoing, that justice would come through law, not violence. Many believed them because humans wanted to believe the galaxy could be better than its history. When Earth formally requested protection for its colonies under galactic law, the request was delayed, then buried in committees. No one said no directly. They simply made sure no answer ever arrived. That silence hurt more than any attack. It told humanity exactly how much their lives were worth to those in power. Then came the offer that changed everything. Earth sent a clear message to the Empire. One final attempt at peace before fear turned into something darker. The message was simple. Earth would forgive past attacks. Borders could be redrawn peacefully. Trade could continue. All Earth asked was recognition and safety for its people. No tribute, no surrender, just respect. The response came weeks later, not as a formal reply, but as action. An Empire fleet entered a human-controlled system under the excuse of an inspection. They fired without warning. Civilian stations were destroyed. Evacuation ships were shot down. By the time the fleet left, the system was quiet and broken. The Empire called it a misunderstanding. Earth called it a massacre. Grief spread through human worlds like a slow storm. There were no loud riots, no sudden collapse into chaos. Instead, something heavier settled in. Parents looked at their children differently. Soldiers trained longer hours without being told. Scientists stopped publishing research openly. The belief that peace alone could protect them finally died. Not with anger, but with exhaustion. Humanity realized that every peaceful offer had been answered with violence, every act of patience seen as permission. The galaxy had not misunderstood Earth. It had judged Earth and found it safe to harm. Inside the Empire, leaders celebrated quietly. They spoke of maintaining order, of showing smaller species what happened when they asked for too much. They believed fear was the strongest form of peace. Reports about human suffering were ignored or rewritten. Casualties became numbers. Names disappeared. To them, Earth was learning its place. What they failed to see was what that lesson was truly teaching humanity. Humans were not learning submission. They were learning clarity. On Earth, the decision was not made in a single room or a single day. It formed slowly across millions of private moments. A mother watching a memorial broadcast. A commander reading another report marked unresolved. A diplomat realizing their words no longer reached anyone willing to listen. Piece by piece, humanity accepted a painful truth. Peace offered to those who did not value it was not peace at all. It was delay. And delay only gave the strong more time to harm the weak. That realization did not turn humans into monsters. It turned them quiet. The emotional weight of that rejection shaped everything that followed. Humans did not scream into the void. They stopped speaking to it. The embassies closed. The messages ended. Trade routes pulled back. To outsiders, it looked like retreat, like fear. In reality, it was grief turning into resolve. Humanity mourned not just their dead, but the future they had hoped to share with the galaxy. A future where cooperation mattered more than force. When that future was denied, humans chose to protect what remained of their own. And deep beneath the calm surface of that choice, something irreversible began to grow. Not hatred, but certainty. Peace had been offered honestly. It had been rejected completely. Whatever came next would not be born from anger alone, but from the quiet understanding that some doors, once closed, were never meant to be knocked on again. Earth's silence after the last massacre was louder than any scream. For the first time since humanity had reached the stars, no message followed the loss. No protests were filed. No emergency councils were requested. The galaxy noticed the quiet, but most interpreted it the same way they always had. They believed Earth was finally broken. Analysts wrote reports claiming human morale had collapsed. Empire leaders smiled, confident that pressure had worked. To them, silence meant fear. They did not understand that for humans, silence sometimes meant focus. On Earth, grief did not explode into chaos. It sank inward. Cities held memorials without cameras. Flags were lowered and left there longer than tradition allowed. Families gathered not to shout, but to remember. Children asked questions that had no gentle answers. Veterans stopped telling stories of hope and started teaching skills instead. The pain was deep, but it was shared, and that shared weight created something stronger than anger. Created unity. Humanity had argued about many things before, but now there was one truth everyone felt the same way about. No one was coming to save them. Governments changed quietly, not through coups or public collapse, but through agreement. Old debates about borders, politics, and power faded into the background. Emergency councils formed with one purpose: survival. Resources were pooled. Rival nations shared intelligence without conditions. Projects once blocked by fear and pride were approved in silence. Humanity did not announce these changes to the galaxy. There were no declarations, no threats. The stars did not need to know. This was not preparation for revenge. It was preparation to endure whatever came next. Deep under mountains, in oceans, and in empty stretches of space, new facilities came online. They were not marked on public maps. Their energy signatures were masked to look like natural noise. Shipyards once declared closed began to work again. Slowly, carefully. Nothing was rushed. Humanity had learned that speed attracted attention. Patience did not. Engineers worked with a different mindset now. They did not design weapons to show power. They designed tools to end fights quickly, cleanly, without leaving room for response. Every system had one goal: never allow another massacre to happen. The emotional cost of this transformation was heavy. Scientists who once dreamed of exploration now worked on defense. Pilots trained knowing they might never return. Leaders signed orders that weighed on them in quiet rooms late at night. There were no cheers, no speeches promising glory. Only acceptance. Humanity understood that if war came, it would not be heroic. It would be final. That understanding made every decision careful and cold. Not cruel but controlled. In the wider galaxy, small signs appeared, but no one connected them. Human trade ships stopped visiting familiar ports. Data streams from Earth slowed, then faded. Cultural broadcasts ended. To many species, it felt like humans had given up on being part of the galactic family. Some felt relief. Others felt disappointment. Very few felt concern. Earth was becoming irrelevant, and irrelevance was comfortable. It allowed the galaxy to forget what it had done. But a few observers paid attention. Independent traders noticed new human ships that did not match old designs. They moved differently, quietly, without the usual communication chatter. Explorers detected brief energy spikes in empty systems where nothing should exist. Each report was dismissed as error or coincidence. The Empire's confidence remained strong. They had taught Earth a lesson. The lesson had worked. That belief settled deeply into their thinking, making them blind. Inside humanity's hidden networks, a different lesson was being taught. Children learned history not as a story of progress, but as a warning. Soldiers trained with discipline born from loss, not pride. Commanders studied enemy psychology as much as tactics. They learned how the galaxy thought, how it dismissed weakness and respected only certainty. Humans adapted, not by becoming like their enemies, but by understanding them completely. Emotion was not erased. It was controlled, sharpened, and placed behind purpose. There were moments of doubt. Some asked if this path meant becoming what they feared. Those questions were not silenced. They were discussed openly, painfully. The answer that emerged was simple. Humanity would not seek conquest. They would not rule. They would draw a line so clear that no one would ever cross it again. That line would be defended without hesitation. The difference mattered, even if the galaxy never understood it. As years passed, Earth remained quiet. The Empire turned its attention elsewhere, starting new conflicts, expanding borders, repeating old patterns. They did not see the trap forming because it did not look like a trap. There was no bait, no challenge. Just absence. Humanity had stepped out of the story the galaxy thought it was writing. And in that absence, humanity rewrote its own ending. By the time the final transmission was prepared, the silence had already done its work. Earth no longer needed approval or recognition. It no longer needed to be believed. Everything that mattered had been decided long before the message was sent. The silence was not surrender. It was preparation shaped by grief and guided by resolve. And when humanity finally spoke again, it was not to ask for peace, but to mark the moment when asking was no longer necessary. The moment the last transmission began to play in full, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. Communication relays that carried news of trade and war now carried only one signal, passing it from system to system without distortion. There was no dramatic opening, no anthem, no image of flags or fleets. The screen showed only a dark field of stars, quiet and familiar. Then the human voice returned, the same calm tone that had unsettled so many before. It did not rush. It did not fill the silence. It allowed it to exist, as if inviting every listener to remember what had already been done. The voice spoke of facts, not accusations. It listed dates, locations, and names of human colonies that no longer existed. Each one appeared briefly on the screen, not with images of destruction, but with simple markers showing where life had once been. The absence was more powerful than any explosion. No music played behind the words. There was no attempt to force emotion. And yet, across the galaxy, commanders, diplomats, and civilians felt a tightening in their chests. This was not propaganda. This was a record. As the message continued, images began to change. Children standing beside makeshift memorials. Empty streets where cities once thrived. Hospitals running on emergency power. Doctors moving without rest. None of the images showed blood or violence directly. Humans had chosen restraint. They did not need to shock the galaxy. They needed it to understand. The voice explained that these were not moments chosen for sympathy. They were evidence of decisions made and ignored. Each image lingered just long enough to be understood, then faded quietly into the next. In Empire Council chambers, laughter had stopped completely. Some leaders turned away from the screens, uncomfortable with how exposed the truth felt. Others watched in silence, unable to look away. Advisors tried to interrupt the feed, to label it as emotional manipulation, but the words sounded hollow even to them. This was not an attempt to win support. It felt more like a farewell letter, written without expectation of reply. That realization unsettled them more than any threat could have. The human voice changed slightly then, not in volume but in weight. It spoke of peace, not as an idea but as an action. It reminded the galaxy that Earth had offered cooperation without conditions, forgiveness without demand, and patience beyond reason. It spoke of treaties signed and broken, of laws requested and denied. The tone remained steady, but the meaning cut deep. Peace had not failed because humans abandoned it. Peace had failed because it was never accepted. Hearing it stated so simply made denial impossible. Across neutral worlds, people gathered in public spaces to watch the transmission. Many had benefited from human trade and innovation. Some had remained silent when Earth suffered, telling themselves it was not their war. Now, confronted with the full story, that distance collapsed. They saw that silence had been a choice, and choices had consequences. Some felt shame. Others felt fear. If Earth was done asking for fairness, then the galaxy had lost a voice that once tried to hold it together. The message did not call for sympathy. It did not ask anyone to stand with Earth. Instead, it explained that the transmission existed for one reason only, to ensure that no one could claim ignorance. The human voice said that history would record what had been offered and what had been returned. That record would not be edited or softened. It would stand unchanged no matter what followed. That statement carried more weight than a threat. It suggested that Earth had already accepted the cost of whatever came next. As the final minutes of the message approached, the visuals shifted again. This time there were no images of loss. There were images of Earth itself. Oceans moving under sunlight. Cities rebuilt after earlier disasters. People working together in silence. Not celebrations, not military displays, just life continuing with quiet determination. The voice explained that humanity did not see itself as a victim. It saw itself as responsible. Responsible for protecting its people when no one else would. In hidden command rooms and open markets alike, listeners felt the emotional shift. The message was no longer about the past. It was about resolve. The calm tone now made sense. This was not the voice of a dying planet. It was the voice of a species that had finished debating its own worth. The realization spread slowly, like a cold tide. Earth was not asking the galaxy to change. It was informing it that Earth had changed. When the transmission ended, there was no dramatic closing line. The voice simply said that this was Earth's last transmission under the old understanding of peace. The screen went dark. No signal followed. The silence that remained felt heavier than before. Systems waited for reactions, for follow-up messages, for negotiations to begin. None came. Earth had spoken, and then it had stepped back into quiet, leaving the galaxy alone with the weight of what it had heard. For the first time in generations, the Empire did not know how to respond. There was no enemy to strike, no demand to reject. Only a record of choices and a sense that something irreversible had just occurred. The galaxy had not been threatened. It had been judged calmly and completely. And in that moment, many understood too late that the transmission was not the beginning of a conflict. It was the end of an era, and whatever followed would not be shaped by words anymore. The first human fleet did not arrive with warning sirens or loud declarations. There was no challenge sent across open channels, no demand for surrender, no signal of hostility that the galaxy was used to recognizing. Space itself seemed to hesitate, as if reality paused for a single breath. Then the stars bent. In regions long considered empty and safe, distortions appeared, quiet and precise, like the surface of water touched by invisible hands. One by one, shapes emerged from nothing. Not explosions, not flashes, just presence. Massive silhouettes forming where nothing had existed before. Sensors across the Empire screamed errors. Readings conflicted with one another, refusing to settle on clear data. Size estimates changed by the second. Energy levels spiked and vanished. Commanders demanded answers, but their systems could not agree on what they were seeing. The ships were there, undeniable, yet they did not behave like any fleet the galaxy had ever encountered. They held position without movement, without broadcasts, without threat displays. They simply existed, silent and impossible to ignore. From a distance, the human warships looked almost unfinished. No glowing symbols, no exposed weapons. Their hulls were dark, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. Edges were smooth, broken only by subtle lines that hinted at hidden systems beneath. To alien eyes trained to read power through display and noise, this restraint was unsettling. These ships were not trying to look strong. They did not need to. Their silence carried more weight than 1,000 war cries. In the Empire's border sectors, panic spread through command networks. Patrol fleets scrambled, forming defensive lines out of habit more than strategy. Officers shouted orders they had practiced for decades, but the words felt weak as soon as they left their mouths. The human ships did not respond. They did not advance. They did not retreat. They waited. That waiting was worse than attack. It suggested patience, confidence, and complete control of the situation. Veteran commanders felt a familiar chill, the kind that came before great disasters recorded in history. They recognized the pattern too late. Only civilizations certain of their outcome could afford to be this calm. Only forces that had already calculated every response would choose silence over intimidation. Some quietly ordered their crews to stand down aggressive maneuvers, fearing that even a small mistake might trigger something irreversible. Others, driven by pride and fear of appearing weak, prepared their weapons anyway. Across neutral systems, traders and travelers froze their routes, watching the news feeds in disbelief. Human ships were appearing not in one place, but in many, spread with careful precision along key Empire pathways. It was not a random show of force. It was a statement written across the map of space itself. Humanity had chosen where to stand, and every position mattered. The galaxy began to understand that this was not a reaction. It was a plan unfolding exactly as intended. Inside the Empire's capital, the Council demanded immediate action. Some leaders called for a full-scale strike, insisting that allowing the humans to remain uncontested would show weakness. Others hesitated, pointing out the lack of hostile action. They argued that attacking without provocation could unite the galaxy against the Empire. The debate was sharp, emotional, and urgent. But beneath the arguments lay a deeper fear. No one could explain how the human fleet had arrived undetected, or what it was truly capable of. Then, without warning, one human ship moved. It was slow, deliberate, almost gentle. It repositioned slightly, aligning itself with an Empire military station that had once coordinated raids against human colonies. There was no message sent, no explanation given. The station's commanders watched in silence, waiting for the expected threat signal. None came. The human ship simply stayed there, close enough to be impossible to ignore. That single movement spoke louder than any declaration. Humanity remembered. Emotion rippled through human worlds as news of the fleet's appearance reached them. There was no cheering, no celebration. Families watched quietly, holding on to each other. Many had lost someone to the Empire's attacks. Seeing the fleet did not bring joy. It brought release. A heavy, aching tension that had built over years finally loosened. Humanity was no longer alone. They were no longer silent. The galaxy could no longer pretend they were irrelevant. Within the human fleet, crews remained focused. Orders were followed with calm precision. Every movement had been planned long before this moment. There was no hatred in their actions, no rush to punish. Only purpose. The emotional weight each crew carried was real, but it was contained, guided by discipline and memory. They were not there for revenge. They were there to ensure that what had happened to Earth would never happen again. The galaxy waited for the next step, hearts caught between disbelief and dread. Would the humans speak again? Would they attack? Would this end in sudden destruction? The answer did not come immediately. The fleet remained still, like a quiet storm holding its breath. In that stillness, a truth became clear to those willing to see it. The last transmission had not been empty words. It had been a promise, and the arrival of the fleet was its proof. The Empire answered the presence of the human fleet the only way it knew how, with force. Orders were sent through command channels that had never questioned themselves before. Defensive lines became attack formations. Weapon systems powered up across dozens of sectors, filling space with energy signatures that pulsed like a threat meant to scare the humans into retreat. Admirals spoke with forced confidence, reminding their crews that the Empire had crushed stronger enemies than this. They told themselves that silence meant hesitation, that humanity was bluffing, waiting to be tested. Pride demanded a response, and fear demanded it be immediate. The first shots were not meant to destroy. They were warning strikes, calculated to pass close enough to human ships to show power without starting full war. Bright streams of energy cut through space, tearing open the darkness with violent color. In Empire command rooms, officers leaned forward, waiting for alarms from the human fleet, waiting for panic, waiting for reaction. None came. The human ships did not scatter. They did not raise shields in a visible way. They did not respond at all. The warning shots faded into nothing, swallowed by systems no scanner could properly read. That was the moment doubt truly took hold. Empire crews exchanged uneasy looks. Something was wrong. No fleet ignored an attack unless it could afford to. Some commanders ordered stronger strikes, convinced that hesitation would only weaken their position. This time, the weapons were real. Focused fire locked onto a single human vessel near the edge of the formation. Power surged. Space shook. The blast should have torn the ship apart. Instead, when the light faded, the human vessel was still there, unchanged, its dark hull absorbing the aftermath like it had absorbed the silence before. A ripple of shock spread through the Empire's ranks. Systems reported impossible results. Damage estimates showed nothing. Energy absorption levels exceeded known limits. Engineers argued over data while gunners waited for new orders. The human fleet remained silent, unmoving, as if the attack had never happened. That silence was no longer calm. It was judgment. Humanity had allowed the Empire to act first. Now there could be no misunderstanding about who chose war. Without warning, the human response came. It was not loud. There was no massive volley, no storm of weapons filling the void. One human ship released a focused pulse toward the Empire station it had been watching since its arrival. The pulse was invisible, detectable only by a brief distortion in space. The station's shields failed instantly. Systems shut down in perfect sequence. Lights went dark. Weapons went silent. The station did not explode. It simply stopped existing as a threat. Crews inside were left alive, drifting in powerless silence. Across multiple sectors, the same thing happened. Human ships targeted command centers, weapon platforms, and fleet coordinators. Each strike was precise, controlled, and final. No civilian structures were touched. No random destruction followed. Empire fleets found themselves blind, unable to communicate or coordinate. Their ships were not destroyed, but they were rendered useless, floating relics of a confidence that had just shattered. Emotion crashed through the galaxy in waves. On human worlds, tears flowed freely for the first time in years. Not from joy, but from a deep, aching relief. The nightmare that had haunted them, the fear of being erased without consequence, was breaking apart. Humanity was defending itself, not with rage, but with undeniable competence. The message was clear. They did not need to destroy everything to win. They only needed to end the threat. Inside Empire command rooms, chaos replaced certainty. Leaders shouted conflicting orders. Some demanded total war, others begged for communication channels to be reopened. They wanted to talk now, to explain, to negotiate. But the human fleet remained silent. The time for words had passed. This silence was different from before. It was not preparation. It was action already taken. Veteran Empire officers felt something they had not felt in generations. Regret. They remembered the early human messages, the calm requests for peace, the warnings dismissed as weakness. They saw now what those words had truly been. Not pleas, but boundaries. Boundaries they had crossed again and again, convinced there would be no consequence. Facing the quiet efficiency of the human response, they understood the cost of that arrogance. As Empire power structures collapsed without a single planet being destroyed, the galaxy watched in stunned silence. Humanity was not conquering. It was correcting an imbalance. It was proving a lesson that no one could ignore anymore. Strength did not always announce itself with noise and fear. Sometimes it arrived quietly, waited patiently, and ended the fight with precision and restraint. And for the Empire, that realization came far too late. When the second human message finally came, it did not arrive as a broadcast meant for the whole galaxy. It appeared first inside the shattered command networks of the Empire, slipping through damaged systems and broken channels with calm certainty. Where once there had been noise, alarms, and desperate orders, there was now only silence and a single clear signal. Empire officers, stranded on powerless ships and darkened stations, watched as the human transmission activated their remaining screens. There was no anger in it, no triumph, only a measured voice, steady and controlled, speaking as if the chaos around it did not exist. The voice did not introduce itself. It did not name leaders or demand surrender. It spoke instead of rules. Not laws written by councils, not treaties signed and ignored, but principles learned through loss. Humanity explained its way of war in simple words, words chosen so there could be no confusion. "We do not conquer," the voice said. "We do not rule. We do not erase cultures." Each sentence landed with quiet force, echoing through empty halls and drifting ships. For those listening, it felt less like a speech and more like a boundary being drawn in front of them. The message continued, explaining that humanity fought only to end threats, not to create fear. That was why stations had been disabled, not destroyed. Why fleets had been silenced, not annihilated. Why civilians had been left untouched. The voice stated clearly that every target had been chosen because of its role in aggression against Earth. Nothing more, nothing less. There was no pride in the explanation, no demand for gratitude. It was simply how humans chose to act when pushed beyond patience. Emotion surged among the stranded Empire crews as the meaning settled in. Many had been taught that mercy was weakness, that sparing an enemy only invited future rebellion. Yet here they were, alive because humanity had decided they should be. That realization cut deeper than any weapon. Some felt shame for orders they had followed without question. Others felt confusion, their worldview cracking under the weight of evidence. Humans were not behaving like monsters, nor like conquerors. They were behaving like judges who had already reached a verdict. Across the galaxy, fragments of the message leaked beyond Empire space. Neutral worlds replayed it with growing unease. Smaller species listened carefully, hearing something they had never heard from a powerful force before. Limits. Humanity was not claiming dominance. It was setting rules for engagement and consequences. It was telling the galaxy exactly how far it could be pushed, and what would happen if that line was crossed. For some, the message brought comfort. For others, fear. Clarity has that effect. On Earth, people gathered quietly as news of the second message spread. There were no celebrations, no chance of victory. Instead, there was reflection. Parents explained to their children why the fleet had acted the way it did. Soldiers listened with heavy hearts, understanding the responsibility placed on them. Humanity had chosen restraint not because it was easy, but because it mattered. They had chosen to show the galaxy that strength did not require cruelty, and that power could exist alongside control. The emotional weight of that choice was immense. Every spared enemy carried the risk of future conflict. Every disabled station could someday be rebuilt. Humanity knew this. The decision was not naive. It was deliberate. By acting this way, humans were shaping how they would be remembered, not just as survivors, but as a standard others would be measured against. They accepted the burden that came with that role, even knowing it would be questioned and challenged. Inside the remains of the empire, leaders struggled to respond. Their old language of threats and domination no longer worked. How do you intimidate someone who refuses to be impressed? How do you threaten a species that has already accepted the cost of defending itself? Some called for vengeance, but their words rang hollow in dark rooms with failing lights. Others began to understand that the war they thought they controlled had already ended. Not with their defeat, but with their exposure. The human message ended without flourish. It did not promise peace. It did not threaten annihilation. It simply stated that any future aggression would be met the same way, without anger and without delay. Then the signal closed. The silence that followed was different from before. It was not tense. It was settled. A line had been drawn, and everyone who heard the message knew exactly where it was. For the galaxy, this was a turning point. Humanity had rewritten the meaning of power. They had shown that restraint could be more terrifying than rage, and that mercy, when chosen freely, could carry more weight than destruction. The Empire had learned this lesson through loss and humiliation, but others were watching closely. They understood that the age of ignoring human warnings was over. From this moment on, humanity would not need to raise its voice. The rules had been spoken, and the galaxy would remember them. The fall of the Empire did not come with a single great explosion or the collapse of a capital world. It came quietly, like a structure rotting from the inside once its supports were removed. With command stations disabled and fleets left powerless, control slipped from the hands that had held it for centuries. Orders no longer traveled across space. Threats carried no weight. Worlds that had obeyed out of fear began to realize that fear no longer protected the Empire. And once that realization spread, loyalty dissolved faster than any weapon could have destroyed it. On distant planets under Empire rule, governors waited for instructions that never came. They watched their skies, expecting punishment fleets to arrive when they hesitated. None appeared. Communication lines that once carried absolute authority were silent or filled only with fragments of old commands repeating without purpose. In that silence, local leaders were forced to make choices for themselves for the first time. Some tried to maintain control, clinging to the old ways. Others quietly stepped aside, opening talks with their own people, admitting that the Empire could no longer protect or punish them. Rebellions did not begin with violence. They began with refusal. Workers stopped sending resources. Military units stood down, unwilling to fire for leaders who could no longer guarantee victory. Flags were lowered without ceremony. On some worlds, citizens gathered in public spaces, not to celebrate, but to ask what came next. The Empire had promised order through strength. Now that strength was gone, and the promise meant nothing. Throughout it all, the human fleet did nothing. It did not advance into Empire space. It did not support rebellions or issue demands. Human ships remained where they were, silent witnesses to the consequences of choices made long ago. This restraint confused many. Empires were supposed to expand when they won. Conquerors were supposed to claim territory. Humanity did neither. Their absence from the unfolding collapse made it impossible to blame them directly. The Empire was not being overthrown by humans. It was being undone by its own history. Emotion ran deep across the galaxy as news spread. Species that had once allied with the Empire out of fear or profit now rushed to distance themselves. Old treaties were quietly abandoned. Records were erased. Leaders claimed ignorance, pretending they had never supported the attacks on Earth. Some felt real regret. Others simply feared being next. Humanity watched it all without comment, understanding that guilt expressed only when power fades is not the same as accountability. Inside the remnants of Empire leadership, despair settled in. They had believed their rule was permanent, enforced by fleets and fear. Now they saw how fragile it had always been. Power taken by force required constant force to maintain. When that force was neutralized, nothing remained. Some leaders attempted to send messages to Earth, seeking negotiation, forgiveness, or alliance. None were answered, not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to discuss. The terms had already been set. On Earth, people followed the collapse with mixed emotions. There was no joy in watching worlds struggle with sudden freedom. Humanity knew too well the cost of rebuilding after loss. Aid ships were prepared, not as a show of dominance, but as quiet readiness. They would help where asked, but they would not impose solutions. That, too, was a lesson learned. True stability could not be forced. As weeks turned into months, the empire became a memory rather than a presence. Its name still carried weight in history, but its authority was gone. New councils formed among former member worlds, cautious and uncertain. Many looked toward Earth not as a ruler, but as a reference point. Humanity had shown that strength could exist without control, that power did not have to mean ownership. That idea changed how the galaxy thought about leadership itself. The emotional impact of the Empire's fall lingered long after the last human ship powered down its weapons. Regret spread through those who had mocked Earth's early pleas for peace. They replayed old messages now, hearing meaning they had ignored. The calm human voice, once dismissed as weakness, now sounded like wisdom. Too late, many understood that the Empire had not been defeated by human force alone, but by its refusal to listen when listening still mattered. In the quiet that followed, the galaxy stood at a crossroads. Old systems had failed. Old assumptions had been shattered. Humanity did not step forward to claim the center of this new order. Instead, it stepped back, allowing others to decide what kind of future they wanted. That choice, more than any battle, marked the true end of the Empire. And in that space left behind, the lesson of Earth's restraint and resolve began to take root, reshaping the galaxy in ways no fleet ever could. After the Empire's fall, the galaxy did not celebrate. There were no great festivals, no songs of victory echoing through the stars. Instead, there was reflection, heavy and unavoidable. Across thousands of worlds, people replayed Earth's last transmission again and again. What had once been ignored or mocked was now studied with painful attention. Every word, every pause, every calm sentence carried new meaning. The message that had sounded weak before now felt unbearably honest. Regret spread quietly, not as a sudden wave, but as a slow understanding that settled deep into collective memory. On neutral worlds, leaders gathered in small rooms instead of grand halls. They spoke in low voices, reviewing old decisions, old votes, and moments when they had chosen silence over responsibility. Many remembered receiving Earth's early requests for help and deciding it was not worth angering the Empire. At the time, it had seemed practical. Now it felt cowardly. The realization hurt more than any external punishment could have. They had not been forced into injustice. They had allowed it. Former Empire worlds felt regret even more sharply. Citizens learned the full truth about the attacks on human colonies, information that had been hidden or twisted for years. Memorials were built not only for their own dead, but for those lost because of Empire ambition. Parents struggled to explain to their children why the galaxy had turned away from a species asking only for safety. Veterans who had followed orders began to speak openly about what they had done, carrying guilt that no victory could erase. Humanity's restraint had left them alive, but it had also left them with time to remember. Even within the human fleet, regret existed, though it took a different form. Soldiers and commanders watched the galaxy's response in silence, wondering how many lives could have been saved if the early warnings had been taken seriously. They did not feel pride in being proven right. They felt sadness that it had taken such loss for others to listen. Humanity had won its safety, but the cost of reaching that point weighed heavily on those who understood it most clearly. Throughout the galaxy, new discussions began. Academies revised history lessons. Analysts wrote long reports on the failure of collective security. Philosophers debated whether peace could survive in a universe that rewarded force. At the center of every discussion was the same question. What if Earth had been heard? The question had no answer, only consequences. Regret became the common thread connecting species that had once believed themselves too different to share understanding. There were attempts at apology. Delegations prepared messages addressed to Earth, carefully worded and deeply emotional. Some were sincere, filled with acknowledgement of guilt and responsibility. Others were driven by fear, hoping to secure protection or forgiveness before it was too late. Humanity responded to none of them publicly. Silence was not rejection. It was distance. Earth was no longer seeking validation or remorse. The past had already shaped the future. In private, on Earth, people grappled with the emotional weight of being remembered this way. Humanity had wanted partnership, not pity. Respect, not regret. Seeing the galaxy mourn what could have been was painful in its own right. Yet there was also a quiet resolve. Regret, while heavy, meant understanding. Understanding meant change, even if it came too late to help Earth's lost worlds. That thought brought a small measure of peace. As years passed, Earth's last transmission took on a new role. It was no longer just a message. It became a warning taught to future generations across many species. Listen when peace is offered, instructors said. Do not mistake calm for weakness. The words echoed in classrooms and council chambers alike. They were no longer human words alone. They belonged to the galaxy. The emotional echo of regret did not fade. It shaped policy, alliances, and caution. Leaders who rose after the Empire's fall were haunted by the example of Earth. They knew that ignoring injustice could create consequences beyond control. Humanity had not demanded regret, but the galaxy carried it anyway, a reminder carved into memory by quiet resolve and irreversible choice. And in that shared regret, a fragile hope emerged that perhaps, someday, peace would be taken seriously the first time it was offered. The galaxy had changed, but the weight of what had happened hung heavily over every star system. The collapse of the Empire had not brought celebration or relief. It brought reflection, quiet and unavoidable. Every species that had once looked at Earth as weak now studied it with a mix of awe and fear. Analysts replayed old communications, diplomats read transcripts line by line, and historians reconstructed events that had once seemed insignificant. The calm humanity had maintained, the patience they had shown, the restraint they had practiced. All of it had left an impression far stronger than any fleet of weapons could. Silence, it seemed, could be more powerful than the loudest cry of war. On Earth, there was no triumph. The streets did not fill with cheering crowds, and no leaders gave speeches of victory. Instead, people moved quietly among memorials of the past, looking at names and dates that carried the weight of lives lost. Families still mourned those who had died in the massacres, and every celebration of survival carried an undertone of remembrance. Humanity had achieved safety, but not without cost. The emotional scars were deep, running through generations, and they were visible in the eyes of those who remembered. Yet with each step forward, a sense of purpose strengthened. Humanity had survived the worst the galaxy could offer, and they had done so without losing themselves to hatred. That was the most remarkable part of all. The human fleet, now resting in orbit around strategic systems, remained quiet. Ships were not bristling with weapons in anticipation of attacks, but neither were they idle. Maintenance crews worked tirelessly, ensuring that every system could respond immediately if threat returned. Training exercises were conducted not for aggression, but for readiness. Human commanders knew that the galaxy had changed, and yet the lessons of patience and restraint were never forgotten. Emotion ran quietly beneath every order, a steady undercurrent of resolve and memory. Humanity had learned that survival demanded more than firepower. It demanded clarity, discipline, and self-control. Meanwhile, remnants of the Empire struggled with their own emotions. Regret had taken root, growing slowly, quietly. Leaders replayed the moments they had ignored Earth's earlier messages. Moments when they had dismissed calmness as weakness and pleas for peace as naivete. That regret was not fleeting. It settled into every decision, shaping strategies, alliances, and even personal relationships. Officers who had once shouted orders that destroyed human colonies now worked quietly to rebuild systems they had once broken. The galaxy's memory was full of grief, and that grief would never fully disappear. Humanity's restraint had ensured it. On neutral worlds, the emotional impact was profound. Communities that had benefited from human knowledge and technology recognized the consequences of their inaction. Schools taught children not just about survival, but about understanding, patience, and the dangers of dismissing others. Trade networks were restructured with care, treaties rewritten with clarity, and conflicts avoided through thoughtful diplomacy rather than threats. The calm humanity had demonstrated became a model, a standard against which all decisions were measured. The galaxy, for the first time in centuries, understood that power was not merely the ability to destroy, but the capacity to choose restraint in the face of provocation. Yet even with this recognition, the cost remained. The memory of massacres, of lives lost due to arrogance and misjudgment, lingered like a shadow over every system. It was a constant reminder that peace could not be assumed, that warnings must be heard, and that patience could be both a strength and a peril if ignored. Humanity carried this weight with dignity, knowing that the galaxy's regret was a lesson they had earned, but one that could not undo the past. The emotional resonance of Earth's final actions shaped future generations. Children who had grown up hearing of the calm fleet, the measured restraint, and the lessons of patience were taught to value wisdom above pride. Scientists and diplomats, soldiers and leaders alike, learned that the most powerful force in the galaxy was not aggression nor conquest, but the quiet certainty that comes from knowing your worth, protecting your own, and acting only when necessary. Humanity had not sought glory, but it had earned it through discipline, foresight, and an unwavering sense of moral clarity. By the end of this period, the galaxy knew one unshakable truth: humanity could not be dismissed. Every species, every leader, every civilization understood that calm did not equal weakness, patience did not mean passivity, and restraint did not signal fear. The memory of the massacres, the empire's fall, and the human fleet's silent judgment became a story that traveled faster than any fleet. It was a story of quiet strength, of sorrow turned into resolve, and of a species that had survived not by shouting louder than its enemies, but by standing steady, measured, and unyielding in the face of injustice. And that story, whispered across light years, ensured that Earth would never again be underestimated. The galaxy had settled into a new reality, but the echoes of humanity's choices reverberated endlessly. Earth no longer needed to broadcast its presence or prove its strength. The lessons had already been learned, inscribed in the memory of every system, every leader, every citizen who had witnessed or survived the collapse of the empire. Humanity did not seek glory. They did not patrol conquered space or impose dominance. Instead, they observed quietly, ready, and patient, understanding that the weight of restraint carried a power no weapon could match. The silence they maintained was not emptiness. It was a statement, a reminder that control and calm could be stronger than rage and conquest. On Earth, people moved through their lives with a tempered pride. Streets that had once been filled with fear and tension were now full of careful rebuilding, not in haste, but in precision. Schools, hospitals, and industries operated with a sense of shared purpose that had been forged in fire and loss. Families continued to mourn those who had died, honoring their memory not with grand gestures, but with quiet dedication to the future. The grief had not vanished. It had become foundation. Every child taught, every teacher guiding, every citizen working together, carried a piece of the memory, ensuring that the lessons of pain and restraint would persist through generations. Even the fleets continued their vigilant silence. Human warships patrolled the borders not with arrogance or threats, but with awareness. Every movement, every scan, every maneuver was deliberate, showing readiness without intimidation. Crews lived with the emotional weight of responsibility. Each officer knew that the galaxy's memory of past massacres, ignored warnings, and calculated restraint demanded constant attention. Every decision they made, every simulation they ran, was tempered by empathy and the knowledge of what had come before. Humanity's greatest weapon was not firepower, but foresight paired with moral clarity. Elsewhere, the remnants of the empire had dissolved into uncertainty. Leaders who had once relied on fear and authority now lived with the full burden of regret. Systems that had oppressed, destroyed, or ignored Earth's early calls for peace now struggled to govern themselves. Citizens who had obeyed because of intimidation were left to make decisions for survival, often without guidance. Many worlds struggled, yes, but the influence of humanity's example could not be ignored. The calm, measured power displayed by Earth became a mirror in which the galaxy saw itself. Some saw failure. Others saw opportunity. Few could ignore the lesson that restraint, applied with precision and certainty, commanded more respect than aggression ever could. The emotional weight of the past hung like a quiet storm across the galaxy. Memorials were built not only on Earth, but on distant worlds, honoring those lost in the massacres, those who had fallen to empire arrogance, and those who had survived to witness the turning point. Humans did not dictate these acts of remembrance, but they were silently acknowledged, respected, and understood. The story of what had happened, the calm transmission, the measured response, the fleet that ended the empire's threat without annihilation, was repeated in hushed voices, taught in classrooms, and recounted in councils as both a warning and a guide. Within humanity itself, the final transmission was no longer a message. It was a legacy, a reminder that the galaxy's mistakes could not erase the responsibility of each individual, that patience and restraint carried their own consequences, and that the cost of inaction could be far greater than the cost of measured action. Citizens and soldiers alike carried this emotional truth as a mantle, not as a burden of pride, but as a commitment to ensuring that the horrors of the past would never be repeated. Every child learned that courage was not loud. Every leader learned that power was not measured by destruction. Every human learned that survival demanded clarity, empathy, and unyielding purpose. The galaxy, watching from every corner, could not unsee what had been done. Humanity had acted with precision, with judgment, and with mercy, yet the memory of their actions imposed itself upon all who had been complicit in past atrocities. Regret, caution, and a newfound respect spread across star systems, guiding decisions, shaping policies, and reminding every civilization that Earth's silence was never weakness, and their restraint was never vulnerability. In the end, humanity did not claim empires. They did not demand submission. They simply stood, steady and resolute, a calm force in a galaxy that had once believed it could ignore them with impunity. And in that quiet strength, in that emotional weight carried not as pride but as responsibility, the final chapter of the Empire's arrogance was written. The galaxy remembered and humanity endured, not because they sought war or vengeance, but because they understood the value of measured action, the power of restraint, and the unshakable truth that a species capable of such resolve could never be forgotten or underestimated again. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of lessons, full of memory, full of respect earned and mistakes recorded. And across the stars, in every system that had ever doubted Earth, the emotional echo of their restraint, patience, and unwavering resolve continued to resonate, ensuring that history, finally, would never forget.